Hello everyone, and welcome back to another Solo Spooky Story. My name's Rob, and today I'll be your host. For those of you who don't know, the Solo Spooky Stories are short stories every other week where I will present a case that I found pretty interesting, or in the case of today, we have a listener submission where they ask us to talk about something, and, they're just something different. People seem to enjoy them, and it's more of a one-on-one episode than, the witty banter that happens between myself and Suze every other week. But, yeah. With that said, I hope you're having a lovely day whenever it is that you're listening to this, and we'll just get right into it. So, as I said, this came in from a listener. It was a listener submission of someone who's asked to not be named, which is totally fine. That's absolutely fine. They messaged us on Instagram, which is great. And they asked us to look at the paranormal during the First World War, which is quite a specific topic, but the context that they gave was when I did an episode on the Fox sisters, where we talked about mediums and psychics and things like that. I had mentioned that seances and things like that had become more popular during and after the First World War, where naturally there was a lot of people dying and interest in the occult and the paranormal became more widespread as people were dealing with psychological trauma and loss and all sorts of things. So they asked me to look into it further, and yeah, I'm ever obliging. So this is what we're looking at today. I myself have a personal interest in all things, military history. I have a qualification in it, and so I'm always happy to look into these sort of things. So yeah, I thought this would be a perfect setting to discuss the paranormal and occult during the First World War, a one-on-one conversation with you, the listener. So there's a lot to this. There's a huge amount to this, and I'm not going to cover everything today. So this could serve as a part one to be followed up with if people are interested, where we'll talk about various different supernatural sightings, some legends, even some kind of spiritualist practices, and just general paranormal phenomena that occurred during the First World War. And as I said, if people are more interested, we can absolutely revisit this topic at a future point, either as a solo episode again, or if you'd like me to bring Suze into this, or another guest to talk to myself and Suze about this, we'd love to. So with the eruption of the First World War in 1914, to say that it transformed the political and physical landscape of Europe is an understatement. It dramatically impacted every facet of life, particularly in Europe. And one of these areas that it dramatically impacted as well was, I suppose, the spiritual and the, paranormal terrain as well, where amidst the horrific war that was going on among the relentless artillery barrages that were going between each side, particularly on the Western Front, the use of chemical warfare and gas and things like that, and overall, I suppose, just the ceaseless psychological strain of trench warfare, tales of the occult and supernatural began to circulate, initially among the front lines, but then quite quickly moving towards the home front, where soldiers and civilians alike found themselves immersed in this, cultural moment where ghostly apparitions, prophetic omens, and miraculous interventions offered some sort of solace or warning, or simply a pause for reflection in the middle of conflict. And a number of stories came out, ranging from these angelic battlefield visitations and spectral warnings, to more widespread, spiritualist movements, particularly around seances and crafting of talismans and things like that for protection for soldiers on the front. This wasn't the first time this was done, but obviously just due to the scale of conflict, it was much larger and broad-reaching. And we'll kind of touch on it a bit today, that a lot of these tales are kind of rooted in personal experience and were very much so shaped afterwards through forms of propaganda, psychological necessity in certain circumstances, popular literature, and I suppose almost this idea of a collective folklore amongst the troops, on the front, and then those back at home, hearing these stories and building on the folklore that's already there. So yeah, as I said, today we're going to have a bit of an exploration of a few of these, more vivid and compelling accounts of paranormal phenomena during the First World War. And yeah, we're going to just kind of dip our toes into it, see what people think. And as I said, if there's more interest in this, we can absolutely revisit at a later time. It is a really, really interesting topic, and there's so much to it. It's it's one of those topics that the more you delve into it, the more you find that there's so much more to it that is just underneath the surface. And I myself didn't really appreciate the scale of this when the listeners submitted to us. So, this is a journey that we're going to go on together. So yeah, it's a super, super interesting topic. It does start to wade into the Second World War, but naturally, I have a bit of caution around discussing occult practices in the Second World War due to the connotations there. But, maybe there's a way that we can deal with that as well in the future, if there's interest there. So I suppose the most famous account or apparition that I want to talk about, and this is one that you hear about all the time, is the Angel of Mon, or Mons, and the, I suppose, angelic apparitions that appeared during this conflict. And this is probably the most famous supernatural legend to emerge from the First World War. And the myth is rooted in, I suppose, the days that followed the retreat during the Battle of Mon in August 1914, where the British Expeditionary Force, who were heavily outnumbered by the advancing German troops, were trying to put up as much of a resistance as they could in the fields of Belgium before being forced into this rapid and at oftentimes exhausting withdrawal to basically get back to their safety. And as soldiers began to stagger back towards the relative safety of their front, rumours began to radiate through the British ranks and then ultimately the civilian population back home. At the moment, basically, of utmost peril, there was a rumour going around that a host of supernatural beings had basically intervened at the last moment and had saved the British force from annihilation. So the most common version held that as desperate men began to pray on the front and in the trenches and, in the midst of battle, columns of angelic figures appeared, and that they effectively stood as sentinels between the armies, that they at points swooped down to drive off the German cavalry that were basically advancing on the British forces. And in certain accounts, these were kind of depicted as these, I suppose, classical angels that were in this like white robes and they had golden auras about them, and that basically they swooped down to protect the British forces from the evil Germans effectively. Other accounts talked about that they took the form of the bowmen of Agincourt, and that they were basically coming back to save the British forces from what they had been facing themselves hundreds of years prior at that same battle, that they basically came back as a sort of ghost army, like what you'd see in like the Lord of the Rings, where they came back to protect people once again and stop another atrocity from happening. So yeah, there was, I suppose, various different accounts. Some people then obviously jumped on it and said that it was St. George himself, obviously, who's one of the bigger saints in England, who came out on a shining steed, and that he himself shot off ghostly arrows into the advancing German forces to basically drive them off. And this story swept through not just the soldiers, but the people back home, and maybe to a certain extent more so the people back home. They were immediately, I suppose, latching onto this in their droves, basically as a sign that they were being protected by God, effectively. And the really, really interesting thing about this specific event is that it really highlights how mass media and public belief were basically about to explode. We were in the 20th century. They're really starting to explode and really kind of gain legs and traction themselves. And like this story really kind of came about, like we're talking August 1914. By September 1914, it's actually been reported in the news. The Welsh author Arthur Machen actually published a piece called The Bowman in the Evening News, and this was a short story written in documentary style describing how ghostly archers of Agincourt were summoned to aid the British troops, and that St. George himself led the charge, and that, yeah, basically that this was all a sign that they were on the correct side of history. Machen himself was actually quite an established author at this point, and he was quite adept in both Christian and, I suppose, pagan lore. And he chose to not label this story as fiction. And what ended up happening was he pretty much convinced a large group of people by not labeling this as fiction that this actually happened. And it's just to show that these stories can really gain legs. And when this was published, numerous requests started pouring in asking Machen for his sources and permission to reprint the tale in church magazines and in pamphlets, and that basically I think Mackin realised what he'd effectively done. He started to explain that the story was pure fiction, but that he was then told by his own readers and by clergymen that he must have merely elaborated a factual account. So his own story, it was taken from him, and he was told that he had misinterpreted and that he actually was telling a true story, basically. And rumours began to snowball. There was parish magazines talking about it, sermons talking about it, and basically complete rejections of, I suppose, the real story's fictional status. And by spring of 1915, tales of supernatural intervention had basically reached this fever pitch. Variations were coming out about angels on the battlefield, these phantom bowmen, St. George himself, and allegedly even Joan of Arc, basically, were all reported as being there aiding the British. And there was then naturally stories coming out of German soldiers being found with arrow wounds. Despite a total lack of any sort of forensic evidence, there was stories of this happening, and then automatically then there's tales being accompanied by artist renderings, songs being written, and then all of a sudden witness statements. A lot of them obviously being second-hand witness statements, but still witness statements coming out saying that no, this is all true, this is all real, and that this actually happened. So by May 1915, spiritualist magazines had actually come alive with testimony. One of the magazines is called Light, and in it they actually found a British officer who claimed to have seen a luminous cloud interposed between the German and the British forces, and that it started protecting the British against enemy fire. One soldier even basically wrote a sworn affidavit. He described this presence as a flash that disrupted the German cavalry charge. It scattered horses and caused confusion, and that basically it had saved the day. Now, it came out not that long afterwards that this story was debunked. The soldier wasn't even present at Mons at all, but it didn't matter. There were numerous accounts starting to come out where even a Red Cross nurse was basically incorporated into this. She had delivered second-hand stories of visions into her memoir. Her name was Phyllis Campbell, and her memoir was Back to the Front: Experiences of a Nurse. And in her telling, she talked about dying soldiers claiming to have seen angels and St. George, and basically just reaffirming everything that had been reported. And yeah, it basically just, as I said, it just created this whole movement that for some reason or another, God was on their side and that everything was okay. And naturally enough, it eventually found its way into wartime propaganda that the angels of Mons basically had basically participated in a battle, and that this absolutely then, was a sign that they were on the correct side and it was the Germans who were wrong, and that the British were right in what they were doing in the war and everything like that. So, it really did grow legs and just went from there. So if I suppose the legend of Mon is the best known, it's far from alone, as was what I've said. And throughout the war, soldiers and nurses told stories, as I mentioned earlier, of these otherworldly clouds. They also mentioned seeing spectral cavalry, sudden apparitions that came just before a disaster happened, and that all of these signs were there to warn them or to protect them during their time of need. I suppose in several versions collected by spiritualist publications, soldiers reported seeing shapes, and they talked about seeing shapes that looked like they had outspread wings. They had some sort of like gold tint around them and were basically being attributed to being angels. These luminous clouds that I talked about, this became quite a talked about phenomenon, that they were there to basically protect soldiers on the battlefield. And they were almost viewed as these, I suppose, omens that, when these sightings were seen, it was viewed as an omen that they were being protected, and that it was an intervention basically by higher powers. So yeah, there's so much to this, and I suppose it got to a point then where naturally with these stories of angels and ghosts and clouds and all that, you then start to hear more personalized stories. So one that I want to focus on today is the ghost of Lieutenant Desmond Arthur, and this takes place in Montrose. And I suppose not all World War I ghosts are attributed to the Western Front, and I suppose one of the most enduring military hauntings, for the British side anyway, is that of Lieutenant Desmond Arthur. So he was an Irish aviator killed in a 1913 crash at the Montrose Aerodrome in Scotland. And Arthur's death was the first in Scotland's military flying training program. It triggered not only a technical investigation, but in the years that followed, a series of ghostly appearances. And eyewitnesses, including a major, who I really love how they noted that he was regarded as a sober, rational officer, reported seeing Arthur in full flying suit and goggles gliding through the officers' mess or entering the aerodrome bar before vanishing mysteriously. And I suppose they noted that the timing of spectral appearances often coincided with controversial moments in the investigation of the crash, and that basically he was apparently seen quite a lot after official findings rebuked Arthur and attributed the crash to pilot error. So Arthur's friends then even came forward, and they were actually convinced that the pilot's ghost actually haunted the station. That not simply as this kind of tormented soul, but that he was actually doing it in protest against what he felt were unjust aspersions on his reputation. And basically, these sightings continued all throughout the early start of the war, and allegedly all ended when the official investigation came out and Arthur's name was basically cleared in a subsequent inquiry. Which, I love this. His business was done, his work is done. He left after this. And it even, I suppose, carried forward then into the Second World War, where the Montrose ghost was brought back. And yeah, people talked about seeing these stories of ghostly biplanes and airmen flying around the base, and that they basically almost effectively revived the story of Arthur during the Second World War to show that, people were still there and all of this sort of stuff. So really, really interesting stuff. I suppose more stories of ghosts then that we see. The poet and soldier Robert Graves actually stands amongst probably the most credible witnesses to some sort of supernatural encounter during the war. As a captain in the British Army at the time, he was serving in France, and he wrote a fairly chilling account actually in his 1918 poem called Corporal Stare, and it was actually included in a collection called Fairies and Fusiliers. And Graves and his men were allegedly enjoying a night off after a fairly harrowing deployment, and they were halfway through a celebratory meal when Graves looked up to see Private Challoner standing at the window. The private allegedly saluted him, turned, and he walked down the road, leaving behind only the burning butt of a cigarette. And this was a pretty normal occurrence, I suppose, except for the fact that Graves was deeply unnerved by this, because he was certain that Challoner had died weeks beforehand. And he actually writes in it that he was torn apart horribly by machine gun fire. Graves then went on to say that he actually recalled Challoner's last words, spoken in England as, "I'll meet you again in France, sir." So he hadn't basically seen him up until this point. I don't think they ever met again in France, but somehow he saw this private salute him in France when he was there. Graves never wavered from his account in all of this, though, and he actually explored similar themes and apparitions in his other poems. And I suppose, being a poet, he kind of had this mix of what was potentially a metaphor and then what was potentially direct testimony, and he masterfully interweaved the two. And yeah, he's one of these more famous, I suppose, witnesses to it, and people put a lot of more I suppose, credence on what he said, because not only was he an officer, but he was an established enough author and poet at this time. So one or two other sightings, and I suppose we'll leave it there because I don't want to give you everything. If you want a little bit more, you can look into yourself, or I can talk about it at a future point. So a really, really interesting one that I looked into, and I hadn't heard about this at all before, was, I suppose, these liminal beings. So I suppose among the most evocative and mysterious folktales of the war are those involving the wild men of no man's land. So according to lore circulated among soldiers and deserters from all nationalities, that basically there was these, I suppose, just as I said, wild men that occupied the trench networks and no man's land, basically between the various fighting forces. And they would apparently emerge on moonless nights to scavenge supplies, loot, and even prey on the dying. And this became like quite a well-known phenomenon. There was a 1920 memoir called The Squadroon. It was written by Arden Arthur Hulme, and he talks about how one of these salvage units actually warned Beeman, or the author, to not advance on his own into the old Somme trenches. And they basically warned him that it was actually populated with wild men, that it was made up of these British, French, Australian, and German deserters who'd lived there underground like ghouls, and that they came out at nights to plunder and kill, and that you'd often hear gunfire in the middle of the night or inhuman cries, and this sense of what he described as a bestial presence hovering between the lines. And all of these kind of stories all combine to form this warning, I suppose, of like caution to not go out at night on the trenches for fear of being attacked by these wild men creatures that were just waiting there, living underground, just waiting for someone to put a wrong foot somewhere. It's potentially a useful tactic for soldiers who might believe this sort of stuff, because they'll never go out on their own. They'll travel in pairs or travel in groups, and I could see the value to this in some weird way. Or for whatever reason there might be some fact to it. I don't know. I doubt it, but you never know. And yeah, that it's just, I suppose, with war changing so much at the time and becoming this like industrial warfare that we all know now, I suppose it's only natural that a lot of people would maybe try to interpret psychological trauma in a way of kind of shaming these people who experience things like post-traumatic stress disorder and all like battlefield fatigue, I suppose, by shaming them by saying that they become these wild madmen who have no control over their actions anymore, rather than trying to explain the fact that some people were deeply, deeply affected psychologically by what they were seeing. But, that doesn't look good. So instead, let's talk about these wild men and how they're mindless, and they're all deserters, by the way, so they should be shot. And, let's put them out there and serve as a warning effectively to anyone who has the gall to think that they might be experiencing any sort of PTSD or something, that this is what's waiting for them otherwise. So the last topic I want to talk about, and it wouldn't be a me episode unless I somehow managed to get this in, was the bizarre aerial phenomena that were known and seen in the First World War. And I suppose the most famous person or flying person in the First World War is the Red Baron. And I suppose one of the most sensational claims to emerge involves himself. So Manfred von Richthofen is his name, the Red Baron. And according to an account related by fellow German pilot Peter Votzrik, the Red Baron actually encountered what he described as an upside-down silver saucer with orange lights during a patrol over Belgium. This is in the spring of 1917. And this story only came out decades later by Votzrik, where he was telling his story, and he claimed that the Baron engaged the craft with machine gun fire, somehow managed to shoot it down, and it crashed into the woods, and that two creatures fled the wreck, which is wild. Unfortunately, the Baron couldn't back up any of this because he died during the war. But I just found it really interesting that there were stories of a UFO being shot down by the Red Baron, which is mental. Now, it did only come out decades later, so a lot of people pointed to this being credence, like laying credence to it, that it wasn't used as some sort of propaganda tale, that it was actually just this guy who talked about it afterwards, but maybe it was for his own popularity or whatever, we don't know. Naturally, the legend itself is completely unverifiable, and it is broadly rejected by historians. But a lot of people have said that it's the imagination of an aging veteran or a hoaxer. But the story has kind of found home in tabloid newspapers or books on wartime mysteries, and even some modern UFO literature. And it's kind of illustrated how the uncertain, I suppose, technological terrain and the fog of war created not just these stories of angels coming down, but then also of extraterrestrial beings also just having a look at the war going on 30 years before Roswell was even considered. So, it's a really, really interesting topic. And yeah, there's definitely a lot more to that I won't talk about today. But yeah, that's kind of an overview of some of the stuff that went on. There is so much more to this topic that I could talk about, and I would be happy to talk about it more if people are interested. There's probably 2 or 3 more episodes worth of stuff to talk about. It's super, super interesting. But yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. If this is something that you've heard about before or read into, or if there's some areas that I didn't talk about today that you'd like me to focus on, please do let me know. You can get us on social media at Threads and Instagram at the SpookyAFPod. You can get us on YouTube in the comments once this episode goes up, or you can get us on Gmail at the SpookyAFPodcast@gmail.com. As I said, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. If you have any topics that you'd like me to look into myself or Sue's or both of us together, please do let us know. And yeah, apart from that, I hope you're having a lovely day whenever it is you listen to this, and I'll catch you in the next one. Take it easy, guys.